It was a warm afternoon. School had just ended, and Eddie was on his way home. He walked slowly, his school bag bouncing on his back. He didn't mind the walk. It gave him time to think. But today, something caught his eye near the school gates. A scruffy black and white dog stood there, watching the children walk by. His fur was messy and dirty, and he looked tired. But his eyes were different. They were big and brown, kind but sad too. It was like he was hoping someone would notice him. Eddie stopped. He had never seen this dog before. Most of the kids walked past without even looking, but Eddie couldn't. The dog's eyes seemed to speak to him. "Hey there, buddy," Eddie said softly. He crouched down a little, trying not to scare the dog. The dog didn't move at first. He just stared, his ears perked up. Eddie reached into his bag and pulled out the sandwich his mom had packed. It was peanut butter and jelly, his favorite. He hadn't eaten much of it at lunch. He broke off a piece and held it out. "Here, you hungry?" The dog took a step closer but still seemed unsure. Eddie didn't rush him. He stayed still, hand outstretched. After a few moments, the dog slowly came forward, sniffing the air. Then, with a quick movement, he gently took the sandwich piece from Eddie's hand. "There you go," Eddie smiled. The dog chewed and wagged his tail, a small wag, almost like he wasn't sure if it was okay to be happy. Eddie broke off another piece of the sandwich and gave it to him. This time, the dog didn't hesitate. "You don't have a collar, huh?" Eddie asked, looking around. No one seemed to be looking for a lost dog. The animal looked thin, like he hadn't eaten properly in days. Eddie stood up and slung his bag over his shoulder. He looked down at the dog. "You want to come with me?" The dog tilted his head, as if thinking about it. Then slowly he followed Eddie. Eddie walked carefully, glancing back to make sure the dog was still with him. He didn't know much about dogs, but this one seemed gentle. By the time they reached the front of his house, Eddie had already started thinking about names. Maybe Spot? Nah, too common. How about Oreo? You're black and white, like the cookie. The dog didn't seem to mind the name. He just wagged his tail again. Eddie pushed open the gate and walked up the small path to the front door. He could already hear his mom inside, probably busy with housework. He took a deep breath and opened the door. "Mom, I'm home," he called out. His mother, Angela, stepped into the hallway, wiping her hands on a towel. She had dark hair tied back and a tired but kind face. She smiled when she saw Eddie, but raised an eyebrow when she noticed the dog behind him. "Eddie, what's this?" Eddie rubbed the back of his neck nervously. I found him near school. He doesn't have a collar, and he was really hungry. Can we keep him? Just for a little while?" Angela sighed. "Eddie, you know having a dog is a big responsibility. They need food, walks, and care. It's not something you can just decide on a whim." "I know, Mom, but he's really sweet. Look at him." Eddie gestured to the dog, who sat quietly at his feet. "He's not causing any trouble, and he was all alone." Angela looked at the dog. He sat perfectly still, as if he understood that this moment was important. His big brown eyes met hers, and she sighed again, softer this time. "Okay," she said after a moment. "He can stay for tonight, but we'll talk about it tomorrow, all right?" "Thank you, Mom. You're the best." Eddie ran over and hugged her. The dog wagged his tail again, a little more confidently this time. That evening, Eddie made sure the dog had water and a blanket. When he went to bed, the dog quietly followed him and curled up at the foot of the bed, sighing contentedly. Eddie smiled and whispered, "You're safe now." The dog blinked slowly before resting his head on his paws, peaceful for the first time in a while. Eddie lay in the quiet, already feeling a bond with his new friend. The next morning, Eddie woke up to find the dog still at the foot of his bed, watching him with warm brown eyes. "Good morning, buddy," Eddie said, petting him. He chuckled as the dog stretched with a deep yawn. "You act like an old man," Eddie teased. As he got dressed, he thought aloud about a name. "Max? No. Lucky? Doesn't fit." Then inspiration hit. "Abe. Like Abe Lincoln. You've got that wise look. What do you think?" The dog wagged his tail. Eddie grinned. "Abe it is." At breakfast, Angela noticed Abe still there. "He's staying, huh?" she asked, arms crossed but smiling. Eddie nodded. "He's a good boy, Mom." Angela agreed they needed to check for an owner, so they headed to the vet after breakfast. Abe walked calmly by Eddie's side. At the clinic, the vet found no microchip. Looks like he's had a tough life, but he's healthy, the vet said. Eddie promised to take good care of him. Angela smiled. This is your responsibility now. Eddie beamed. Abe was officially his. Days passed. Eddie and Abe were inseparable, exploring parks, alleyways, and shortcuts. They played after school, racing and fetching sticks. Eddie taught Abe simple tricks, and soon Abe was impressing other kids in the neighborhood. But Abe was also protective, keeping a watchful eye wherever they went. Eddie felt safe with him around. At night, Eddie sometimes confided in Abe. School's hard, he whispered. I don't fit in, and I miss Dad. Abe listened silently, his presence comforting. Eddie knew he wasn't alone. One day after school, Eddie and Abe explored a deserted train yard on the edge of town. The tracks stretched endlessly, and old train cars stood like forgotten giants. The peacefulness was eerie. Suddenly, footsteps echoed. 3 older boys appeared, looking tough and unfriendly. What's a little kid like you doing here? The tallest one mocked. Eddie tensed, trying to stay calm. One boy shoved him lightly, but a low growl from Abe stopped them cold. Abe stood protectively in front of Eddie, his eyes fierce. The boys hesitated. Better keep that mutt on a leash, the leader muttered, backing off. They hurried away, leaving Eddie shaken but relieved. He hugged Abe tightly. You scared them off, he whispered, grateful. When they got home, Angela was waiting. I was worried. Where were you? Eddie explained about the train yard and the boys. Abe protected me, he said. Angela knelt to stroke Abe's head. Good boy, she said softly. She looked at Eddie. No more wandering to places like that alone, okay? Eddie nodded. I promise. You're more than just a dog, you know that? Eddie whispered. Abe lifted his head and blinked at him. Eddie smiled. You're my guardian. The next morning, Eddie sat at the kitchen table, finishing his cereal. Angela was busy packing his lunch, humming softly to herself. Eddie knew he should tell her more about what happened in the train yard, but he didn't want her to worry. He decided to keep it simple. Mom, yesterday at the train yard, some older kids showed up, he said casually. Angela paused and turned to him. Older kids? What happened? Nothing serious, Eddie replied, trying to sound calm. They were just messing around. Abe scared them off. It's no big deal. Angela frowned. Eddie, you should have told me sooner. I don't like the idea of you running into trouble like that. I know, Mom, but really it was fine. Abe had my back, Eddie said, smiling. He patted Abe's head as the dog lay beside his chair. Angela sighed and nodded. All right, but be careful, okay? I don't want you going back there. I won't, Eddie promised. After breakfast, Eddie grabbed his school bag and headed out with Abe walking beside him. Even though Abe couldn't come to school, Eddie always brought him as far as the school gates. See you later, buddy, Eddie said, giving Abe a quick hug. Abe wagged his tail, watching Eddie as he walked through the gates. Throughout the school day, Eddie couldn't stop thinking about Trey and his gang. He wondered if they were still angry. But every time he started to feel nervous, he remembered how Abe had stood up for him. It gave him a new sense of confidence. At recess, Eddie noticed them. Trey and the other 2 boys were sitting on a bench near the edge of the playground. They weren't doing anything, just watching. Their eyes followed Eddie wherever he went. Eddie tried to ignore them, but it was hard. He felt their stares like a weight on his back. Hey, Eddie, Marco called, running up to him. Want to play soccer? Sure, Eddie said, shaking off his unease. He joined the game, focusing on the ball instead of the boys. By the time recess was over, he felt a little better. Maybe Trey and his gang wouldn't bother him again. After school, Abe was waiting at the gate, tail wagging happily. Eddie grinned and ran over to him. Miss me, boy, he said, ruffling Abe's fur. Abe barked softly in reply. They walked home together, taking their usual route through the neighborhood. Eddie felt safer with Abe beside him. He knew that no matter what happened, Abe would always be there. Over the next few days, Eddie and Abe continued their daily adventures. They explored the park, raced down quiet streets, and practiced new tricks. Abe quickly became an expert at catching sticks in midair. Good catch. Eddie laughed as Abe grabbed the stick before it hit the ground. In the evenings, they played in the front yard while Angela watched from the porch. She noticed how different Eddie had become since Abe came into their lives. He's more confident now, Angela thought to herself. She smiled as she watched Eddie laugh and run with Abe. For the first time in a long while, Eddie seemed truly happy. One evening, Angela sat beside Eddie on the porch steps. "You know, Abe has been really good for you," she said softly. "Yeah," Eddie agreed. He glanced at Abe, who was lying on the grass, his ears twitching as he listened to their voices. "He's my best friend." Angela reached over and squeezed Eddie's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Eddie. You've grown a lot lately." Eddie felt a warm glow in his chest. He hadn't realized how much Abe had helped him until now. But things weren't completely peaceful. Trey and his gang weren't done with Eddie. A few days later, as Eddie walked home from school, he noticed them again. This time, they were standing on the corner of a street not far from his house. Trey caught Eddie's eye and gave him a cold, hard stare. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. He quickly looked away and kept walking, his hand tightening on Abe's leash. Abe sensed his tension and moved closer, his ears perking up. "Just ignore them," Eddie whispered to himself. "They can't do anything as long as Abe's with me." The boys didn't follow, but Eddie knew this wasn't over. He had a feeling that trouble was coming. He tried to push the thought out of his mind as he and Abe reached the safety of their front yard. Angela greeted him at the door. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing the worried look on his face. "Yeah, I'm fine," Eddie said quickly. He didn't want her to know about Trey. He didn't want to scare her. Next day, as the school bell rang, and Eddie gathered his things. Normally, Abe would be waiting for him at the gate, but today was different. Angela had asked Eddie to leave Abe at home. She needed him inside to keep her company while she worked on some projects. Eddie didn't mind too much. After all, it was just a short walk home. As Eddie stepped out of the school grounds, he felt a little uneasy. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. He walked quickly, his mind drifting to thoughts of Abe. He already missed having his dog by his side. The uneasy feeling grew stronger when he heard footsteps behind him. Eddie glanced over his shoulder and froze. Trey and his gang were there, a few yards back, slowly catching up to him. "Hey, Eddie," Trey called out with a smirk. Eddie's stomach twisted. He tried to stay calm and kept walking, pretending not to hear them. "Where's your mutt, huh?" Trey said louder. The footsteps grew closer. "No mutt to save you now." Eddie's heart pounded. He clenched his fists, trying to stay brave. He didn't want them to see he was scared, but deep down, he felt trapped. Suddenly, Trey and his gang moved faster, circling around Eddie. They blocked his path, forcing him to stop. Trey stepped forward, grinning. "Thought you could just walk away, huh?" he sneered. "You embarrassed us back at the train yard." "I didn't do anything," Eddie said quietly, his voice trembling just a little. "Oh, you did plenty," Trey said. He gave Eddie a shove, making him stumble. The other boys laughed. Another shove came, harder this time. Eddie barely kept his balance. "Leave me alone," Eddie said, his voice stronger now. Trey laughed. "Or what? What are you going to do, huh?" He grabbed the strap of Eddie's backpack and yanked on it. Before Eddie could react, a deep, low growl cut through the air. It was a sound Eddie knew well. His eyes widened in surprise and relief. "Abe." The boys froze, looking around in confusion. The growl grew louder as Abe appeared from around the corner. His teeth were bared, and his body was low to the ground, ready to protect Eddie. His eyes were fierce, focused on Trey. "Whoa," one of the boys gasped. "This dog again?" Trey muttered, taking a step back. "What's with him?" Abe didn't bark. He didn't need to. His growl was enough. He advanced slowly, muscles tense, making it clear that he wasn't afraid of them. "Get that dog away from me," Trey said, his voice losing its confidence. Eddie straightened up, feeling his fear melt away. Abe was here. Everything would be okay now. He didn't have to face them alone. "Looks like you're the one scared now," Eddie said, his voice steady. Trey glared at him, but didn't move closer. Abe took another step forward, his growl deep and steady. Trey cursed under his breath and backed away. "Let's go," Trey muttered to his friends. But one of the boys started to protest. "I said let's go." Trey snapped. He shot one last glare at Eddie. "Not worth it." The boys turned and walked away, muttering to each other. Trey spit on the ground before leaving, but he didn't dare look back. Eddie stood still for a moment, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. When he was sure they were gone, He dropped to his knees and hugged Abe tightly. "You always find me, don't you?" Eddie whispered. Abe licked his face, his growl now gone. His tail wagged slowly as if to say, "I've got you." Eddie smiled and wiped his face. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." They walked side by side, Abe staying close to Eddie the entire way. Eddie felt safe again, knowing that Abe would always protect him. When they reached the front yard, Angela was outside, sweeping the porch. She looked up and saw them approaching. "There you are," she said. "I thought you were coming home earlier. Is everything okay?" "Yeah," Eddie said, glancing down at Abe. "We just had a little adventure." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Adventure? Nothing to worry about," Eddie replied quickly. "Abe had my back, like always." Angela smiled and shook her head. "You two really are a team, aren't you?" "Yep," Eddie said proudly. He gave Abe another pat on the head. The sun began to set as they went inside. Eddie knew that trouble could still find him, but he also knew that Abe would always be there. With Abe by his side, Eddie felt ready for whatever came next. Later that evening, after dinner, Angela called Eddie into the living room. Abe padded quietly behind him, his nails clicking softly on the floor. Angela motioned for Eddie to sit next to her on the couch. "Okay," she said gently. "I want you to tell me everything that's been going on. No more half-truths, all right?" Eddie hesitated, then sighed. "All right," he said. He knew he couldn't hide the truth anymore. "There are these older boys, Trey and his gang. They've been bothering me since that day at the train yard." Angela's eyes widened. "Bothering you how?" "They've been trying to scare me," Eddie explained. "At first, they just shoved me a little. But today, they really surrounded me. They were about to take my backpack." He paused and looked at Abe, who was sitting calmly by his feet. Then Abe showed up. He scared them off again. "He protected me, Mom." Angela stared at him for a moment, her expression a mix of concern and relief. She took a deep breath and reached out to stroke Abe's head. "Thank you, Abe," she said softly. "You protected my boy." Abe's ears perked up, and he gave Angela's hand a gentle lick, as if saying, "Of course I did. I didn't want to worry you," Eddie continued quietly. "That's why I didn't tell you everything before." Angela shook her head. "I'm your mom, Eddie. It's my job to worry. But I'm glad you told me now. We'll figure out what to do about those boys. And I am so thankful that Abe was there for you." Eddie nodded. He felt lighter now, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. They sat quietly for a moment, the only sound coming from the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. After a while, Eddie stood up. "I think Abe and I are going to sit outside for a bit." "All right," Angela said, "but not till late, okay? It's a school night." "Okay," Eddie replied, heading toward the front door. Abe followed closely behind him. The evening air was cool and peaceful. Eddie sat on the porch steps, leaning against the wooden railing. The sky was dark now, with tiny stars beginning to sparkle above. Abe settled beside him, resting his head on Eddie's knee. "You know, Abe," Eddie began softly, "you've done more than just protect me. You've changed my whole life." Abe tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening carefully. "I used to feel so alone," Eddie continued. "School was tough. I didn't have many friends. And after Dad left," he paused, his voice catching a little. "After Dad left, it just felt like something was missing. But then you showed up." Eddie smiled and scratched behind Abe's ears. "You're more than just a dog, Abe. You're my family." Abe's tail wagged slowly. He leaned closer and licked Eddie's face, his warm brown eyes full of love and understanding. "Yeah, I know you get it," Eddie said, chuckling softly. "You always do." They sat there together, enjoying the quiet moment. Eddie felt safe and happy. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel small or afraid. With Abe by his side, he felt strong. The sound of crickets filled the air, blending with the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Eddie leaned back, gazing up at the stars. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: Abe would always be with him. After a while, Angela peeked out the front door. "Eddie, time to come inside." "All right, Mom," Eddie called back. He stood up and stretched. "Cool me on, Abe." Abe got to his feet and shook himself, his tail still wagging. Together, they walked into the house. As the door closed behind them, Eddie knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together.